Okay, so the people have spoken that there is an interest in my editing workflow and editing food photos. So today we're going to be working on this image, and this was captured on a Fujifilm X-T4 in the Eterna profile, and we're going to be using the latest edition of Capture One, which now has all of its AI subject detect and other new tools that are added to the suite. Many of these tools I'm unfamiliar with, so I'll broach them to the best of my knowledge, and I hope I represent their capabilities well. So first and foremost, when we look at this photo, what we need to analyze is what is the DNA of this photo? Like what is it we've got to work with? And so first and foremost, this is a light and airy photo. Now, light and airy is an aesthetic choice that's got nothing to do with your lighting setup. It's purely an aesthetic choice. So that is part of its DNA. So we want to lean into it. We also have these wonderful colors of orange as well as some blue, and we've also got a very blue tint here in the white balance. So there's a natural color coordination that's already going on here with blue and orange. Now, blue and orange is typically a very overplayed sort of color palette, but it's present. So therefore, there's no reason to swim against the current on this one. Instead, we should lean into it. So this is unscripted, so we'll try not to waffle. Like, let's get right into it. So if we come here to lens corrections, Capture One has successfully detected my camera and the make of my lens, and it's already done light fall off and distortion correction for me. Now, when capturing flat lay images, or any image, but particularly flat lay images, one thing you really want to avoid is pitch and yaw to the camera. So I always use a spirit level to make sure that things are nice and balanced, so and it doesn't look like it's slipping off the table. And in this case, we've got it nice and balanced, so we don't really need to move into any keystone or rotation and flip movements. So we'll just get straight into it. Now, this was captured in the Eterna profile, which is very low contrast and super low saturation, but it also has excellent color fidelity. And I like to start from as neutral of place as what I can. However, not everyone uses Fujifilm cameras, so we'll swap this to film standard. So as you can see, there's been an automatic bump in the contrast and the saturation, and this way this should more resemble any images that you may have from Sony, Canon, Nikon, etc. So let's get straight into it. So as I was saying, we can see in the light fall off here that there's a distinctive blue tint to it. So that means we've got some white balance issues. Now, I set the white balance on this to be 5400, but I don't have the best flash on the planet, so every time it pops, there's going to be a little bit of discrepancy between the outputs. Higher end flashes should take care of that for you, but we're actually going to have to do a little bit of color correction here right at the start. So let's bring in the histogram. So as we can see, the blue channel is quite ahead of all of the rest of the channels, which means it is too cool. So we're just going to bring Actually, we'll bring the white balance tool out so you can all see it much better. We should have enough resolution here. So as we can see right here, the white balance, it's all of the channels are overlapping to form a white line in the highlights. So that would be, I guess you could say, algorithmically or digitally a correct white balance. But because we've got this natural blue and orange going on, I'm actually just going to lower the white balance a little bit just to keep a small thread of that blue there. And that will keep these whites nice and cool. And we're leaning into the DNA of what this photo already has going for us. Now, for now, we will leave the histogram up because we're going to also use this for exposure purposes. Now, as you can see, the exposure is actually quite good. We've definitely got data here in the blacks, the shadows, the undertones, the midtones, upper tones, and highlights, but we've stopped short of clipping the whites. So it's been a good exposure. Well done to me. So let's investigate how we're going to do these base adjustments. So let's bring this up so you can see it a bit better. So the exposure is pretty good. We could probably go up 0.1 of a stop because it is a light and airy photo. But what we're going to do is we're going to lower contrast by about 15 points. We're going to bring the brightness down. Now, brightness in Capture One affects the midtones. So now our histogram is just a little bit more evenly distributed. We've probably dragged it down a little bit too much. About there's good. And we're going to bring down the saturation by 15 points as well. So essentially, I've just brought this to what would have been a Turner start point. So we've got a nice neutral base to start here. Histogram and the shadows, undertones, midtones, overtones, and highlights is still looking great. So we can start moving forward. Now, next tool we're going to bring out is the high dynamic range. So this is more specific to those shadows, undertones, highlights, and overtones. So what we can do here is we'll just bring the whites down a little bit. That this part of the photo right here is still a little bright. And when it comes to composition of the eye and how eye disseminates visual data, it looks for certain things in a specific order. First of all, it looks for human faces. Next of all, it looks for where the brightest area of the frame is, then the highest contrast, and then the highest saturation. So this brightness here could be acting as a distraction from what is this, which is the subject of this photo, and this is a supporting element of the photo. So we're just going to bring the whites down a little bit. Now, one temptation photographers have, especially if you watch others online, is when they see these bright parts of the photo, they attack the highlights and they bring those right down. The problem is when you bring the highlights down, you also remove them from the food themselves. And we want to keep a certain amount of specular highlight to the dish because that's like the twinkle in a human's eye in a portrait photo. It's what gives it life. So don't be afraid to leave your highlights a bit bolder in photos because it helps add depth very much the same as what shadow will. So the highlights is, we're going to just bring it to +4 for now, but we're just going to take the edge off those whites a little bit, but we don't want to kill the highlights entirely. Now, because this is a light and airy photo and there's not really a ton of shadow going on here, but keeping softer shadows in a light and airy aesthetic is very common. So we'll just bring the shadows up just a little bit, not too much. Now, typically as part of my editing style, I don't ever have a true black point in my photo. And here we don't have a black point showing on the histogram, but the photo at this stage is still looking a little flat. So we need a bit more dimension. So we're just going to bring the blacks down just a tad. So we're not making a lifeless flat photo. Next thing, we'll bring through the levels tool. Now, the levels tool is a very powerful tool for setting white point, black points, and midtones, and you can also do it across all 4 color channels. So for here, we're just going to bring that black point up a little bit more, almost to the point we're going to be creating a true black. So let's check our exposure warning. Do we see any blue forming? Let's keep going. So definitely not in this part of the photo where the subject is, but somewhere in here, probably down in here, if we keep pushing, we'll eventually get blue showing. Oh, wait a minute, I see what's happened. I've only just recently updated my Capture One, so I don't have my shadow indicator warnings going. Sorry about that, but normally you would have seen blue pixels begin to form there. So I think that's a relatively good black point. Now, if we bring the midtones up, we're beginning to make a flatter photo again. And that's not per se unattractive, but let's just try going the other way a little bit. Now we're bringing the midtones down. That's probably a bit too much. So we're just going to bring the midtones down just a tad. And on the white handle and highlights, we're just going to bring that back just till, you see, you can see that forming in the red. So I've got the highlight indicator going, but not the shadow indicator. I'll have to change that in my tools. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now we can also go into the red, the green, and the blue channel, and we can now begin to start to add different tints and tones, either for color correction purposes or for color grading purposes. So obviously if you go to the right, you're adding a yellowy sort of green to the image. If you go to the left, you're adding blue, but it's also got a touch of sort of magenta look to it. At this stage, I don't really want to play with any more of these handles because Any further color correction I prefer to do in the tool we're about to explore, which is the tone curves. Now, the tone curves in Capture One are very powerful. There's 5 of them, and just to touch on them quickly, RGB will affect all of the color channels, but the more contrast you add here, the more saturation you will also add. Luma affects contrast without affecting saturation, so that is my preferred tool to use. The red is obviously the red channel, green is the green channel, blue is the blue, and movements you make here, if you go up, you add red, if you go down, you add its opposite color, cyan, and in each of these it's the same. We're adding green, magenta, and blue. You're adding blue, even though it's got this kind of magenta look to it, and you're adding yellow, even though it's actually got a bit of a greenish tint to it. So that's just a quick overview of those. So first and foremost, what we're going to use is this eyedropper, and we're going to tag that is the brightest part of the photo. And we're going to come here to the shadows, because that is the darkest part of the shadow. And we're going to come here to the subject. So sort of about here is where I'd call a mid-tone-ish, about there. Maybe it's a little bit off. Oh yeah, the egg yolk is the mid-tone. So between this point here and this point here, if you pick that up, let me change my pointer. So between here and here, it's between these 2 points that is where I am mostly concerned with the subject of contrast. Anything below here or anything above here, I'm not interested in. So we're going to actually remove that contrast point, and we're just going to start operating in the undertones and the overtones. So if this is shadow, this area here would be undertone, and this area here would be overtone. That's highlight, that's shadow. So we're just going to start making some basic movements. We're just going to start adding some contrast to the dish and the photo. So we've got a nice level of contrast between those 2 points, and as you can see, because of these points here where it's not affecting that part of the histogram or that part of the histogram. So when we also again look at, well, the tone curve, pardon me, when we look at the histogram though, we can see there's a bit of aberrant blue here in the shadows to the blacks. So we might just do some very basic color correction here. And as you can see, it's forming in that shadow area. So we'll put a point here, but we'll also put one here to stop it affecting the whole tone curve. And we'll just make a little bit of movement here. Just to color correct. So I think that's about as far as we can color correct at this stage. We will move through to the color management tools pretty soon, and we'll finish out the rest of that color correction. Now, this consomme is also a sort of yellowy orange color. So we're going to come into the tone curves again, but this time into the red channel. And my fear is if we add a little bit of red here, it's also going to wash through into the tablecloth. So we'll just give it a sneaky little go. Yeah, you can see a magenta red blush here forming. So we're just going to do, like, I think that was like 1 point. We're going to bring these back down in line just so they act as stop points on the histogram for color correction. So we're looking pretty good at this stage that the base of this photo is now looking solid. So now we're going to move on to really highlighting what is the hero of this photo, what is the subject. And in this case, it is this clear broth. Now this has been inspired by a soup that I had when I was in hospital for a week on a clear food diet before doing some exploratory sort of surgeries. And we're creating a narrative here through the pill bottle as well that, you know, that's the story we're wanting to tell. Now, the deeper elements of this story is that the zucchini blossom is sort of representative of new life, and the egg yolk is representative of new life. But we can obviously see this photo has a connection to a medical condition. So we want to keep those storytelling elements. Now, from the chef's perspective, this is a consomme. And a consomme is, when made correctly, it's a whiskey color, but it's also, its clarity is crystal clear. So we've added the spoon so that people can actually see how crystal clear this soup is. But also, as I was saying about visual sort of composition, humans look for other human faces. So this spoon, this piece of cutlery, is going to stand in as the human surrogate because cutlery is pardon me, is a distinctly human invention. So we don't want to lose any of those elements. So if we come through to, let's have a look, layers and masks. If we come through and do the auto subject detect, I have a feeling Capture One will capture the whole bowl and the pill container, and that would be fine, but it might be a bit unnecessary. So let's check them out. Yeah, it has. So well done to Capture One. It's actually really detected what the subjects of this photo are, but because this is more specifically a food photo, I just really only want to get the food. So to speed this along, we're just going to create a mask. Now, I'm sure Capture One has other ways of where I could have, you know, augmented that mask. Oops. Well, we still got the mask present. Let's just remove it. So we'll create a new layer. We'll just make sure our flow's at 100%. It is. So we're just going to quickly go around and make a mask. Okay, now we're going to fill the mask and we're going to refine the mask. That's looking pretty good, especially for the purposes of tutorial. Now we'll just quickly label this. Even though my editing workflow never changes, it's always good to keep your masks, your layers, pardon me, and your masks labeled so you know where you're at. Now, first and foremost, what we'll do next is we're going to bring some clarity into this because there is a lot of clarity to the soup, so therefore it's an appropriate tool to use. And this is going to increase contrast in the midtones of the pixel. And we're also going to increase structure, which is going to increase contrast on the edge of the pixel. So we're really bringing out the fine details of this zucchini blossom. So that's looking good to me. Now we're going to make our first journey into some of the color editing tools in Capture One, which are phenomenal. Yeah, I couldn't live without Capture One now. If I had to go to Lightroom or something similar, I would be quite lost. So we're actually going to use the advanced tool, and what we're going to do is we're going to use the eye checker. We're going to pick the color of that consomme. We're going to select view selected color range, and that's going to make everything that's not within that color range black and white. So it's picked up the egg yolk, the zucchini blossom, well, the orange of the zucchini blossom, and the pill container. Now, because the pill container is not part of the mask, any movements we make here are not going to affect it. So, because this had a lot of ginger and turmeric root and other color imparting ingredients to it, and I want this soup to be representative of a warm, sunny day, that when the patient gets this, it's visually giving them something very warming and engaging and reminiscent of happier times. We're just going to bump the saturation up a little bit. And that's actually far more realistic to what the soup looked like on the day. I don't want the saturation to be garish though, because this is a serious subject. It's about health and life and so forth. So we don't want it to be overly gaudy. And we're also going to lift the lightness as well. The reason for that is we really want to show off that clarity of the soup because that is a technical skill point of making a consomme. So we definitely want that to be in there. So just turn that highlighter indicator off for now because that's okay. So already we're looking pretty good. We'll now deselect the color range so we can see the full color palette. So we're still embracing that blue and orange at this stage. Now what I might do is we're just going to come back to the image layer, which that is a 100% mask from edge to edge. We will come back to the basic color editor. Let's just bring that back out so everyone at home can see it and understand what my thinking is and what I'm doing. We're going to use the color checker. We're just going to tag that color there, which was obviously blue. We're just going to move the saturation down a little bit. We're going to move the lightness up, but we're going to move it far more towards cyan. So that way we've got this orange and cyan color palette. I know it's overworked, but it's in the DNA of the photo, so why fight it? Lean into it. Why try and swim against the current, right? So we're looking pretty good at this stage. The image is now beginning to come to life quite a bit. So from here, we're going to create a new empty layer, and we're going to copy it from the subject. And from here, we're now going to transform it to a luma range. So we're about to begin to start the dodge and burn process. Oh, we can't actually grab the edge of this one. So let's just zoom in so you can all see it a little bit better. Right, we're going to go down towards the blacks. We're going to drag the slider down because we want to accentuate the shadow here for dodging and burning. We are essentially creating a burn layer. We're going to lift the radius just so the mask is a little bit softer and lower the sensitivity so it's got the ability to bleed over the edge of pixels. So it's not, how would you say, a very strong dialed in mask pixel by pixel. It's going to be a much softer mask. We're going to click apply. Now if we come back here to the high dynamic range and the exposure, we can lower the shadow. If we go all the way, that doesn't look quite natural, but so we'll pull it back a bit. We'll lower the blacks a little bit. And we're actually going to lower the brightness a little bit and try and make a very convincing and real looking shadow. And I think that looks really good. So we're now beginning to dial in contrast specific to areas of the photo. So we'll label that one burn. Now the Luma mask has done a great job for me on this one. Sometimes I do need to use like a more of a whack-on tablet and a pen and actually draw it in. But in this case, we've managed to get some nice burn. And we can always add more, but at this stage, we're just getting the foundations of this photo. We're going to create another layer now, and we're going to copy from the subject again. And we're going to also make it a luma range mask. So let's get in here again. So now we're going to do the opposite. We're going to do the dodge. So we don't want to affect the shadow areas that we've just touched. So we're going to bring this down a little bit because there was a little bit of highlight burn on that zucchini flower, so we don't want to start blowing it out. So that's looking pretty good. Again, we're going to lift the radius just to soften the mask a little bit. And we're going to lower the sensitivity again, but not as much this time. We want this one to be a little bit more dialed in, and that's looking really good. So again, we'll come back to the high dynamic range. We'll sort of bump up the highlights. We'll bump up the whites a little bit, and we'll just add a few points of brightness. So if we zoom out again, now that's looking very realistic to the photo on the day, and it's showing off the quality points of that, how do you say, the consomme and its clarity. If anything, I might just lower the opacity a little bit, just so it blends with the shadow mask a little bit better. So that's looking overall very good. We'll just do a quick before and after. So as you can see, the photo is now getting a lot more dimension, which is quite hard to do in a flat lay. So we're getting closer to the end goal. So we will label this one dodge. There we go. Now we're going to do a new filled adjustment layer, and we're just going to call this one saturation. Well, sat. And we're going to make this a luma range again. So even though saturation in captureone is it's a smart tool, so it will keep saturating colors, but it will stop some colors from saturating if they're beginning to get to burn level. So we're just going to create a luma mask of where we're sort of feathering the saturation in this soup a little bit. Okay, we might just increase the radius again, just so the mask bleeds a little bit. So that's looking pretty good, but a lot of the saturation is just down around this side of the angle. So that's not too bad. Sometimes this comes a little bit more naturally. This one requires a little bit more finessing. So we'll stick with there for now. Now, if we were just to blast saturation, like it's obviously added a ton, but at the same time, see how it's stopped anything from becoming color burn? However, I don't like this gradient here that's going on. So we've obviously dialed in saturation way too strong. So we'll just bump it up just a little bit, and that's pretty good. We might just lower the opacity because, again, oversaturating a photo is a very easy mistake to do. So at this point, we're looking pretty good. Now, for the giggles of it, we might just actually use a AI tool here, AI select, and shall we just see if we can target the zucchini blossom? Come on. Yeah, it's done it. Excellent. So what we're going to do here is we're going to come into the color tools. We're going to go to the greens, and we're just going to lift the green color on that a little bit, just so we're not losing the natural beauty of that blossom. But we might lower. Oh, it's such a subtle mask. Well done, Capture One. Just lower the lightness a little bit. We might just bring this a little closer to the yellows. Like not much, just literally 2 points. So, whoop, now we're getting all over the show. So if we come back to that, we can, has it actually created a new layer for us? No, it hasn't. So that one's just dialed in. So already the photo's now looking at in a very good place. So lastly, what we're going to do is create another new field adjustment. And we're just going to call this one color grade. So this is where we get to, well, we begin to add sort of emotion and tone to the photo. Sorry, I've grabbed the wrong tool. Let's put that one back. Let's choose the color balance wheel. Now we can use this for also color correction, but we've already mostly color corrected. So we've got this blue and orange color palette. So let's stick to the cooler colors for the shadows. Let's dial it right in. Yeah, it's definitely, you can do it. You can do it. It's a bit heavy-handed though, so let's just bring that right back. Okay, the midtones, we obviously want those to be orange if we're going to do a blue-orange color palette, but we want the orange to match what's going on here in the subject. So let's just visually eyeball this. That's looking pretty good. So let's just go 100%, shall we? Yep. You can do it. You can definitely do it, but I don't know if it's tasteful. Now, while we're here, we might just use this slider and brighten up those midtones just a little bit. That's looking pretty good to me. Now, in the highlights, I guess we could go for, you know, a little bit of a yellowy green. It doesn't create a traditional color palette. Yeah, we'll just add just the smallest touch. So there we go. We've got like a nice subtle color palette going on. Let's go back to the before and after. Perfect. If anything, it's maybe we could actually come back to the image layer, to the white balance, and just lower the white balance just a little bit more, just to keep that blue and orange theme going. So we're just dialing it in bit by bit now. Now, when this editing session's over, I'll close this photo down and I'll go do something for 10 minutes and I'll come back and I'll open it up. And the very first thing that catches my eye will be the first thing that I change. So we'll leave it at there for now. Now we're just going to do some finishing touches. So let's grab the heal tool because I've noticed some stuff going on here which has been irritating me this whole time. That, you know, anytime you do a photo session, dust is everywhere in this world and it tends to land. Nothing's ever shot in a clean room or a vacuum, so a little bit of debris and stuff has landed here. What did I spot before? In the soup. Consommes are meant to be crystal clear, so any of these little disturbances or aberrations, even though you would barely see them on the final product, you know, it's a fastidious thing, isn't it? Like, let's just get it picture perfect. Never know, this might end up on a billboard for like Men's Health somewhere, so let's just get it right from the start. We've also got a little tiny crinkle there in the tablecloth when moving the plate around, getting composition. Yeah, oh, and we've got some small debris marks here. So, picture perfect, looking good. So, now the next thing that as I look at this, there's some things I'm not happy with still at this stage, and that's more to do with when you make a consomme very, very well, it will give a mirror effect to its clarity. And if we look down here, like we can see, let me choose the right tool. I can see my flash trigger, I can see the outline of my camera, and I can see my lens. So I've done such a good job of making this that, and we can see a little bit of the modifier. So I guess with the heal tool and the clone tool, we could remove some of these, but I think that's going to take a little bit of time, and I don't know what value it's going to bring to this tutorial, but that's something we could definitely look at, removing that mirror image from it. But what I can also see is very much the same as like portrait photos, those catch lights in the eye. Catch lights in food is also super important. And speculoos, it's what gives life to the food. So we're just going to add a little bit more through the style brushes of some these sort of specular highlights just to the edges of the food, down here around the edge of the spoon. And look at that, you can see the reflection of the spoon there. Again, very well made soup on my part. Just bringing back some of that life and some of that depth and giving that 3D realism. So for now, the last stage would be, let's bring out our focus and let's really look in at where the sharpness is. So we'll come back to the image layer of where we'll see what the base sharpening here is. So it's 140. So we might just push that up a little bit just so it's very crisp and very clean. Now, radius and threshold, I know what these are, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. It's basically you are choosing like how dialed in the sharpness will be and how universal an edge and edge it will be. So I do want a bit more sharpening and I do want a bit more threshold, but radius, sorry, but I also want to increase the threshold because there's no reason to put sharpness in this block color of the egg yolk. Really what I want the sharpness to apply to is the micro contrast and detail here in the blossom, and there's no reason to have sharpness in this universal color of the soup of where sharpening doesn't really play any significant role. It's not going to add to it in any way, but I also do want some sharpening on this ridging of the plate because that's acting as sort of natural leading lines directing your eye to that this is clearly the subject of the photo. Now, as a final aside, we're going to come back into the style brushes. I'm going to choose the brightness tool. We're going to work on a new layer, and we might just dial down the brightness just in that corner a little bit, just so it's not so competing with what is meant to be the star ingredient of this, the feature of this photo. So there we go. We've just taken the edge off of that brightness. Might just come back to the subject, one more time. Sort of increase the brightness of there again, just a little bit. Maybe the saturation got a little strong. We'll just take that down just to 3 points. But so far, has a preliminary edit of where we will come back soon and give it a second look with our eyes and see what's the first thing that catches us. That would be the editing workflow for this photo. Now, anytime I shoot food photos for clients or events or promotions or for magazines, I also shoot food for magazines, Cuisine Magazine and so forth. That is my editing workflow. Now, from here, depending on what size we wanted this to be printed at, like for magazines, it's A4. For the workplace and clients, sometimes it's posters and it can be up to A1 or A0. A0 on the size of my sensor, I'll have to put it through an AI upscaler. But, we still can get to A1 pretty easy with this camera. As you see, it's sharp as a tack. So that is the editing workflow, and it's always beneficial to sometimes see how other people approach a sort of situation, but through their eyes and how they do their editing workflow. There is no right or wrong to how you do it. It's more about, it doesn't really matter where you start, it's where you finish. And so from there, we'll also do some other selections about that one was shot with very hard light. Again, that was a very hard light. If we keep going through some of my other selections, that was a very specular light. So we've got a range of different looks that we can go for here. But at the end of the day, this was the one that we decided to edit. That's actually a different photo. That's a natural light. That one was a natural light. But that would be the editing workflow for how I approach my images. So I hope you've learned something from it. I hope you've enjoyed it. And depending on how this video goes, we may make more for the future. Have a great day, guys.